Redditors who lived abroad and moved back to your home country, what is the biggest reverse culture shock? After living in Australia for some time, I went back to Italy and I couldn't believe Italians can't stand in a line while waiting for something. We spread all around like a herd of sheep. Food was even better than I remembered though, especially my grandmother's stuff. When I visited my best friend in Florence, she told me I had to stick my elbows out and basically push people if I ever wanted to get anywhere in a line. She wasn't kidding. Lived in Switzerland for about a year, returned home to Australia and remembered pretty quick that everything is factored towards the lowest common human denominator, i.e., public safety. On some trains in Switzerland, you can open the windows so wide that you could literally jump out whilst it was moving. If we had the same thing in someone would be dead within a week. Laws changed. No more awesome train windows for anyone. So one idiot ruins it for the rest of us. The Swiss have a great collective common sense and are just like, but why would you jump out of a moving train? That's just silly. You would hurt yourself or die. Things like this just don't even enter into their consideration. Aussies equals hold my beer. Similar observation. In Switzerland, the doors on the train or the lift open as soon as it's moving slower than 1 km/h. In the US you have to wait several more seconds for it to come to a dead stop before the interlocks will let you out. No wonder the subway takes so long to get anywhere. I lived in Germany for a year. When I came back to America, the thing that struck me the most is how huge food portions are in restaurants and such. There was a local American place in Germany that served food on comically large plates, but after going back home I realized they weren't all that far off. I lived in Germany for about 2 years. My first day back in America, my dad took me to an all-you-can-eat buffet and I had completely forgot how gluttonous Americans are. One guy's plate was piled up with food so high that I remember thinking that his plate could probably feed an average German family of 4. I spent a semester in South Africa during college. Definitely not long enough to get culture shock. One thing I did notice after getting back to the US is that "how are you doing" is more a salutation than a question. In SA, if you asked someone how they were doing, they would tell you honestly and it might lead to a longer conversation. After being back for a bit, I didn't think about it and once again responded "good, you" without thinking about it. South Africa, where a short conversation is an hour. The sun. After 2+ years of living in sub-Saharan Africa, reasonably close to the equator and having the sun rise around 6 AM and set around 6 PM every day, regardless of the season, my mind was blown when I went back to the Midwest. There's daylight at like 10 PM during the summer. I never thought about the even 12-hour day thing. After living in Canada for 2 years, when I got back to Australia, the biggest ones were lack of choice in regards to everything, especially TV shows and movies, their availability. I went from 4 TV channels in Australia to 300+ in Canada. I kept thinking I was seeing squirrels darting in trees for the first month or 2 back. Was just leaves blowing around. No sports whenever I wanted. It seemed while living over there professional sport was on TV any night of the week instead of mostly just weekends in Australia. All our news presenters and TV personalities suddenly seemed a lot less intense, more chilled out. Our TV ads seemed to yell less. Slower internet. I could no longer smell weed in the air every time I left the house. I lived in Japan for a year. When I came back to the US Houston, it was a diversity that struck me almost immediately. I'm from the US, but moved to Germany when I was 7. Went back to the US for college, then decided on Germany for good. Bread, dude. Americans do not know bread. Germany, there's a bakery on every corner and you will get a decent roll for about 20 cents. Americans have bakeries, but like, why is there so much sliced bread for sale and so little fresh? Why is everything in the bakery section sweet? Also, fun fact, Germans call all square pre-sliced white bread toast. Americans only call it toast when it has been toasted. You do not know how confusing this is. Having lived in 1 American and 1 European country before returning to the UK, I would say the most difficult thing is the switch from having international friends to home country friends. When you live abroad, you tend to mix with people of different nationalities who are all doing what you are doing and are all open to meeting new people and having adventures. When you return to your home country, you are no longer an immigrant, but for a while, You feel like you don't belong there. People in your home country already have their existing friendship groups, which are difficult to break into, and aren't as interested as making new friends and being adventurous as fellow travelers. You feel like you have had a huge adventure, but no one else can relate to what you have experienced, and you feel like you can't talk about it for fear of appearing snobby. Well, this was my experience anyway. Moving back to the UK was the most difficult move I have ever done. You change, but home doesn't. No one understands or cares about your new international experience, knowledge or views. It feels very disorienting. Lived in Australia and Indonesia for 10 years before returning to Canada. I spent a semester abroad in Sri Lanka, then moved back to the US. What struck me the most was the amount of food people waste. In Sri Lanka, it's heavily frowned upon to waste food, even among the wealthy who don't deal with issues of scarcity. Returning to my college dining hall and seeing my friends pile their plates with food to then eat half and throw the rest out was a little jarring and disheartening. My fiancée was in Japan for a year. When she got back, the train that goes from Newark Airport to the NJ Transit train broke down in the middle of the tracks before the stop. Well, stopped for 45 minutes, then started again. If the trains in Japan are more than a few minutes late, they are all over themselves apologizing. I don't know if that was her biggest culture shock, but it was what she commented on immediately. Japan's private public trains versus the crappy American systems are unbelievably different. Really, service in all of Japan versus the US in non-tipped positions blew my mind. The fast food servers were insanely nice and attentive. Lived in Russia for a decade. People don't smile without a good reason. Customer service people in stores tend to be cold, standoffish or outright rude. I'd visit the US and bask in smiles and greetings. But a few years on, something started to change. The smiles started looking fake. The greetings rang false. Why is this lady at the Gap so interested in my day? This waiter doesn't really like me. I realized that I had switched over to the Russian mentality. I'd become used to people being unfriendly to start with, and having to break through, charm them, and watch them become super friendly. I was perplexed by it at first, but it became my MO soon enough. Another thing was how safe my city was. I lived in Moscow at a pretty raw time. It was never super dangerous, but there was always a feeling that crap could pop off any minute. There were plenty of people happy to victimize you or hurt you, sometimes just because you were foreign or different. Then you come home and everybody is so happy and safe. They don't know how good they have it. I appreciate it but find the US super boring. This just reminded me of the time I went into a Starbucks and an American girl was serving behind the counter. I'm in the UK. She seemed so smiley and enthusiastic I actually felt sorry for her for the sour-faced grunt she was getting back from us Brits. I grew up in the US. I then lived in Brazil for a bit. I moved back to the US at 19. I couldn't drink legally in the US. It was so weird to have alcohol taken away as an option. On a happy note, I had somewhat forgotten just how safe the US was. On a sad note, I also forgot how depressed the US population was. That's one thing I hear about Brazilians. They're very silly and mellow happy. Only met 2 Brazilians ever but they were cool. Grocery stores. I lived in suburban US. I lived and worked in 13 countries over a period of 5 years, with my longest trip being about 5 months. What always got to me when I came home were grocery stores. Each country I worked in always had unique challenges. One place, we struggled to find anything drinkable. Bottled water, soda, Gatorade, anything that wouldn't make a foreigner sick. Some places, if you wanted things you had to go to individual stores. Meat came from a butcher, veggies from the market, etc. When you found products, you often didn't have any choices. You took what they had or you went without. Oh, you want milk? We got shelf-stable milk in a box. Oh, you don't like milk in a box? Too freaking bad. That is what we have here. When you spend months away, living in places where people don't have access and a myriad of choices, it is really hard to suddenly come back and make choices. The grocery store was always the toughest for me. Tough to explain. The closest I have ever seen it attempted to be explained is in the movie The Hurt Locker. In the end, after spending a year in the Middle East, a soldier is with his wife, or GF, and kid in the grocery store and she asks him to get some cereal. The next shot is showing him in an entire aisle full of cereal, trying to figure out which one to get and not really knowing how to figure it out. It sounds strange, but I can always feel the anxiety and confusion of that scene in the movie. Almost anything in a grocery store in the US is done to excess. Water? We got water with and without bubbles. You want it from a glacier in Iceland or you want treated municipal water that tastes really good? Plastic bottles bother you? Oh, we have these 6 brands and glass bottles. Would you like clear or green glass 0.5L or 1.0L bottles? US or imported? Mineralized or plain? Caffeine or no caffeine? Natural flavorings added or plain, and all you want is a bottle of water because where you just came from. Tap. It's been shown that having too many choices can become overwhelming and paralyzing. The paradox of choice, I think it's called. The scene you described demonstrates it perfectly. Have multiple friends in various NGOs. The biggest one I've seen is toilet paper. Actual surprise returning to that sweet, quilted love. As far as adjustments, I knew 2 who did some serious time down in South America years on end in medical support. Not stealing as a source of supply procurement took some adjustment. They would pocket everything reflexively. After spending time in Central America, I considered being able to flush toilet paper such a luxury. Money seemed really weird when I moved back to the US from Australia. US coins felt light and tiny in my hands, like if Monopoly had plastic toy coins, and it suddenly infuriated me that all paper denominations were the same color. Wait, you complain that you hated coins because it felt like Monopoly money, but you like Australian dollars because they are colorful, like Monopoly money. When I returned to the US from China, I got my personal space back. Everyone in China is always pushing up against you. In China it's normal to have 20 people crammed in an elevator. And the smoking. The doctors in China smoke while they're examining you. People smoke in the elevators. Once when there were about 12 of us crammed in the elevator, a gentleman was smoking and he almost caught my shirt on fire. It's like they think there is only one elevator and they must all cram into it like their lives depend upon it. Haha. After moving back to the US from Hong Kong, my first thought was how amazing it was to have personal space, and also how exciting it was to find perfectly ripe avocados at a grocery store. I'm American and lived in the Balkans for a year. Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, in that order. I've gotten so used to completely impersonal strangers and overly personal friends that when I got back I briefly thought it was extremely weird that the waiter checked up on us. I missed customer service. I didn't really miss how Americans conduct friendships. We befriend one another, usually, to only have fun together, which is fine. But friendships in the Balkans were much deeper, much faster. I could discuss divisive political matters and reveal all of my deepest, darkest secrets one night. Then the next morning the person I had an argument with was buying me cheese bread and making me coffee. We'd have fun, then go back to calling each other morons over a political argument. And the next day we'd go explore an old monastery or something. In the US this is usually the end of the friendship. This is completely, 100% based off of my anecdotes and by no means defines all Balkan and American friendships, of course. I've had Balkan type friendships with other Americans too. It just seems to be the exception for me personally. Hey there, I'm from the Balkans and everything you said about friendship here is true. Friendship between people here is deep and faster, yeah, especially if you start talking about football. The only people who can't stay friends like that are people of opposite political parties. They just dislike each other a lot. Good to hear you experience the Balkans. Oh, a nice name, BTW. I lived in London for 4 years before moving back to the Netherlands. What was a major shock to me was that the way I feel about myself, define myself, seems to be dependent on how others treat me. The people I surrounded myself with in London were quite eccentric, and I would thus feel free to express myself however I wanted. Nothing seemed too odd. Flash forward to now. There is this saying in the Netherlands, just act normal, then you're weird enough already. That is what is defining my life right now. Being too different is categorized as trying too hard to be noticed, which does not fit my personality at all. But I do miss the freedom of experimentation. I'm not sure this is a London specific thing, I think this is just an expat trait. Lots of people go away to be themselves. In China I became a completely different person from my Canadian or Italian self. I was surrounded by fellow expatriates who were just trying to make it in a crazy world. It is quite a shock being back. A huge shock. I'm from the US. I did a semester abroad in London when I was 20 and turned 21 while I was there, so I experienced legal drinking in the UK before I did at home. It kind of set me up for a lot of disappointment. I can't take my drink outside the bar, I have to tip my bartender, I have to get waiter service if I'm sitting at a table in a pub, I can't enjoy a bottle of wine at my picnic in the park. I feel like I wouldn't have been particularly bothered by any of this if I hadn't experienced England's much more lax drinking laws first. When I lived in Italy, I didn't need to drive anywhere, so I didn't notice that my vision had drastically worsened, because I was never reading things like street signs or billboards at a distance. I got home and suddenly everything was fuzzy when I drove. I realized I needed glasses, had probably needed them for months. But since I never drove in Italy, I never noticed. Island back home to USA. Mine was seeing all the American flags everywhere. Ireland has plenty of Irish flags, but nowhere near as many as America. Whenever I sneeze back at home, I would get told bless you every time. In Ireland, maybe 1 out of 10 times would someone say that. Not a big deal, but I noticed it. Normal grocery shops in Dublin have 15 cereal options, but back in America at Wegmans grocery shops there are 2 aisles dedicated to cereals. It's glorious. Basically just the amount of everything is much bigger due to the larger populations. I love Ireland and Dublin, but there's nowhere like home and its little quirks. Just moved to Galway a month ago from Boston and holy crap, this is spot on. I noticed the sneeze thing almost immediately. I said bless you to about 15 people before I realized that they all ignored me. It pains me to hear someone sneeze and hold in that phrase. Lived in the Baltics for a couple years. I remember getting back and staring at the huge, normal-sized in the US refrigerator at my parents' house. I opened it and was even more surprised at the unbelievably large jar of mayo. I remember wondering how on earth a single family could justify that much mayonnaise. I moved from the UK to a mainland European and back when I was a kid. When we got back to the UK, I couldn't understand why I wasn't allowed to be in pubs bars late with my parents. I moved to Canada from Germany, for good, but every time I go back to visit family I'm surprised at how many people still smoke, how rude and unhelpful people in the fricking service industry are. Canadians are super friendly. I like that about us. I lived in Okinawa, Japan for almost 4 years. When I moved back home, I'd forgotten how individualistic, confrontational, and rude, comparatively, we are in the States. I'd learned to be demure and acquiescing there, and I had to snap out of that very quickly before I got taken advantage of. Everything tasting overwhelmingly rich. Most Japanese food is subtle, even the junk food. For a good 2 months after getting back, everything I ate was either too heavy, too sweet, too salty, or tasted like chemicals. At the negativity, I lived in a social media and news bubble in Japan. I had almost no idea what was happening in the States, and Okinawa is relatively boring. Almost nothing ever happens. The biggest news in 4 years was the rape of a schoolgirl and base protests. Coming home and reintegrating after basically being on vacation for 4 years was extremely difficult and depressing for me. Australia made me realize how much racism in America affected my life. I did the same crap in Australia that I do in America. Teach at a university USQ. Go to the gym. Hang out with friends. Normal crap. But it felt extremely different. White women weren't afraid of me. They actually didn't even notice me mostly. When I met people, there weren't awkward jokes or comments about black people. No one followed me around the store. I even felt comfortable asking police for directions, and they gave them to me and went about their business. I came back to Houston, which is super diverse, and it was the exact opposite. Even my 60-something-year-old mother, who came to visit me in Australia, noticed it. I felt so normal. I felt so normal. Well, you are, D. I lived in Hong Kong for a few years before moving back to the USA. The amount of space we have here is unreal. Like, Walmart is larger than my entire village in the New Territories, but has almost no people in it. I remember staring at deodorant choices for like an hour, because going from 3 choices to 200 choices was also overwhelming, and I kept having a panicky feeling because there were so few people around. It felt like there was a natural disaster or something dangerous and everyone had fled. A sales clerk eventually came by to see if I was okay, and I explained that I had just moved back from overseas and was feeling a little overwhelmed at the amount of choices in front of me. She handed me one, and I left. I'm Australian, but lived in the US for a time, Washington state, and when I came home, the biggest differences were not dressing up, wearing makeup etc every day, like I really feel as though it was 100% expected of me to look nice even just to walk to the store, and not wearing makeup or nicer clothes got me a bunch of weird looks, but here at home it's normal to go to the store in pretty much whatever you're wearing, flip-flops, dirty shorts and an old t-shirt, no problems, no makeup, no one cares. About 80% of the other women you encounter won't be wearing any either. Took me months to stop putting in so much effort on a daily basis just for little things. It came to a head one day when I was really ill and needed to go to hospital but was putting on makeup and my SO just stood in the bathroom door like, being allowed to drink, aged 19-20, was both a shock and a relief. The bread. US bread, normal, store-bought bread is so sweet, it's like cake. To get something that would be considered a normal flavor, I would have to ask for a sourdough. And that is worlds apart from what all sourdough is. Coming home I missed a few bakery items that I have tried and failed to recreate, but buying normal sandwich bread was a weird experience. The grocery stores. I was amazed by the variety and sheer amount of stuff available in US grocery stores, and I missed eating of products when I got home, and the frozen food section of my local Woolworth seemed particularly dismal. It took me years of living in the US to find decent bread. Then finally I found some from a little local bakery run by people who had lived in France. So good. Now I'm in Australia and still think of that bread. After several years in a third world country, it was how rich people were in the US and how much stuff they had. Masses of furniture, nice cars, electronics, clothing and all that. Plus the amount of food they threw away, just as a matter of routine. Lived in Italy for a year. The biggest, and my favorite, reverse culture shock was the incredible diversity of food we have in the US. Here in America, pretty much every somewhat large city has Italian restaurants, Indian restaurants, Chinese restaurants, Thai restaurants. In major cities you get Pakistani food, Ethiopian food, German food, everything. Where I lived, there was Italian food. That was it. There was one American style diner and one very seedy Chinese restaurant, but for almost a year it was impossible to get anything other than pasta and pizza, etc. Which was the best in the world, but months and months of it get sold. I probably didn't eat Italian food for a good 3 months once I got back, too busy gorging myself on curry and pho and burgers. I studied abroad in France for a summer. I came back to American and couldn't finish a combo meal at Chick-fil-A. I used to eat a whole combo and another sandwich. Portion sizes on all food are much bigger. Bread sucks. Cars are oversized for no reason. I understand everything I hear again. I'm British and lived in Ecuador for 6 months. Everyone is just lazy as frick and there are zero public spaces to do stuff in. My city is actually quite good for green spaces, parks. But nobody goes there after dark as it's just full of teenagers drinking. Even then during the day they only get used for kids playing football, people walking dogs or families taking their kids to the swings on the weekends. In Ecuador I lived about 200-300 yards from a bus stop. On my walk to the bus stop I would see 3 separate public places that people would meet at night to play football, or a coup volley. Not an expert on this, but it looked exactly like normal volleyball but minor cheating is allowed. People of all ages, 50-year-old guys, teenagers, young parents while their infants sat and watched. Me and my 2 other white friends joined in the football a lot. Sometimes we played tres leches versus a few locals. The only football that gets played by anybody over the age of 14 here is in organized leagues where you have to book and pay for pitches. There they just had an artificial pitch in a small square in some random neighborhoods. Here everyone has their own house that they lock themselves in every night and watch crap TV, only leaving to go to work or do their weekly big shop and then get very drunk at the pub once a week, then in the city center once a month around payday. Nothing ever happens locally. There sometimes I'd walk around the barrio on a random Thursday night around 8 PM and I'd see hundreds of people gathered around the square watching two groups of middle-aged men playing volleyball. Someone has a stand set up selling some sort of secco. They have a community. They spend time outdoors. We have small family units and live a lot more isolated lifestyle. I spoke very little Spanish but felt more a part of the community there than I do at home, because here there simply isn't a community to belong to. The isolated lifestyle is typical for many places here in the US. South Korea back to UK. Honestly, how boring the towns and cities are in the evenings. Everything shuts early, and if I went out to restaurants or bars as frequently as I did in Korea, I would be broke by now. I lived in Romania for 2 years. Americans have no sense of style, especially male Americans, at least compared to Europe. You can instantly spot the American tour group in Europe by their style. Women will be wearing nice dresses with ugly running shoes. Lived in Japan for 6.5 years, had a kid there, came back to the US in December 2016. Everything here seems to exist to create profit for someone. Your health, or more likely your illness, your poverty, your education, etc. There is zero concept of the greater good or public welfare here, even when it would make more economic sense to do something collectively. In a similar vein, that you put a dollar value on your family's health. I had just started working when my toddler got really sick, and I had to try to figure out, is he sick enough that I can afford the doctor visit, is he sick enough that I can afford a day off work to take him to the doctor, how long can I afford his care if it's not just the flu, etc. Given all the above, the conclusion, here come the downvotes, that America is a massive machine designed and perfected to completely and utterly frick poor people. Put me in the screenshot when someone posts this to our late stage capitalism. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.